So, last week I did my top 10 favorite Volume 1 and Volume 2 records. This time I am doing those records that kind of have that 1-2 punch. And honestly, the hardest thing about both of these lists is trying to figure out how to name it so that people will understand what I'm talking about. So, yeah, these albums are albums that were released at relatively the same time that have that kind of connected tissue. It's kind of like the double shot records. You know, they're not quite double albums because I always figure double albums are albums that are on 2 discs. But this is like part 1 and part 2, but without those kind of naming conventions. So it'll make sense once I'm getting into the records. Just as a reminder, if you haven't already, please consider being a supporter of mine, either through Patreon or through the whole members down below. I recorded a lot of this all at once and slowly, edit and upload them. So like a lot of them are already on my channel. But because I don't want to just inundate your subscription box with all my videos, I schedule them, But if you want to get them all at once, if you become a member, you can watch them right now. So there you go. I want to talk about the criteria of this first, just to kind of get people in the know. These are only going to be 2 studio records that were released almost concurrently, like kind of back to back. There are no EP tie-ins, kind of like how Porcupine Tree did Fear of a Blank Planet and then Neil Recurring, or Mastodon did Emperor of Sand and then Cold Dark Places, or even like Carly Rae Jepsen doing Loneliest of Times and Loveliest of Times. It has to be a certified studio record. The other thing is that these have to be concurrently, so they have to kind of be back to back, and that could stretch over years, that can stretch over months, or days. They could have been released on the same day, but they do need to kind of be back to back. They couldn't have, dropped and then had something else in the middle and then had something else drop later on. So first off, much like I did for that other video from last week, I'm going to do this time a dishonorable mention because there's only one, and that is Load and Reload from Metallica. Yeah, didn't make this list because they're not great. I don't really return to Load or Reload all that often. They're not great. Not great. Now, with all that being said, let's get into the list. The first one being Coheed Cambria with the Aftermath. They put out Ascension and Descension, and sure, it might not necessarily be Coheed Cambria's best work. Actually, it's kind of far from it, but there's still something fun about this. I'm still of the mind that Coheed Cambria haven't done a bad record. They have done albums that are more memorable than others, but you're still getting that really fun, really like the crossroads between emo and rock and, this big epic storyline. And it does finish off this phase of the storyline quite well, or at least kind of, puts a little asterisk on it. And it's fine. It's fine. I do remember both these records being at a record store, and like both of them are being sold for like $3 a piece. And I'm like, wow, somebody bulk ordered a little too hard. But yeah, it's still fun. Number 9 comes to us from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. Their continuation of the microtonal stuff that started with the microtonal banana. But we're not talking about that one. We're talking about the KG and LW. These albums aren't necessarily my favorite, and I'm not a big fan of their microtonal experimentations, but there's still a lot of very fun music found on here. That very garage band, very psychedelic rock that these boys like to play with. It provides a very interesting kind of dynamics where they're trying different things. They're very much experimental in this one. And yeah, sometimes it really works, and other times it's just kind of a forgettable moment. So yeah, not a whole lot to say about KG and LW from King Giz and the Liz Wiz, but yeah, it's still a fun time. And if you haven't listened to either of these albums, I'd say give them a try. Give them a try. All right, number 8, we go to Periphery with Juggernaut with Alpha and Omega. Again, like a lot of these earlier records, these aren't necessarily the band's best works, and in some ways they're kind of some of the weaker moments of the band's, but there's still a part of me that still loves Juggernaut. I know not a lot of people are big fans of Juggernaut from Periphery, but I don't know, there's something special about it. There's this experimentation, there's this trying new things, trying to break out of the mold that they've really put themselves into. But unfortunately, it didn't quite work, so then we get Periphery 4 and 5. So yeah, it's still fun, and I still love Alpha and Omega, even if not a whole lot of people really do. It's just a fun little time. We're going into number 7 with Taylor Swift for her lockdown albums of Folklore and Evermore. These are very folky. These are very like intimate. It's just usually her and a few instruments, either guitar or a piano. I personally love Evermore. I think Evermore is a little bit more cohesive. It's got a better flow to it, but Folklore has better individual songs. And both of these albums, if you trim off maybe about 10 minutes a piece, create a big, really good time. I do think both of these records are a little too bloated, a little too overdone, but I still love just sitting down and listening to the overall atmosphere. And both are doing very similar things. And I love the fact that both were released back in 2020, 2021. And, you know, this started the trend that Taylor Swift has continued where she's dropping just album after album after album, sometimes maybe to her detriment, but still, this holds a very special place, mainly because of where I was and what I was doing at the time of these albums coming out. Okay, number 6 might be a little bit of a cheat, and I completely admit that I know that I'm kind of cheating here, but I'm including Peter Gabriel, self-titled. Some people will call it 3 and 4, some people will call it Melt and Security. Some people will just call it Peter Gabriel, but Melt and Security for me are the two records that kind of are the most linked, you know? Like I always feel like Peter Gabriel is releasing 2 albums at a time that are slightly linked. Like I feel like Car and Scratch are very similar, even though I love Car more. So and Us are very similar, you know, very 80s, 90s rock in that case. And even Up and I.O. are quite similar, even though I think OVO came out between the two. But I think the 2 albums that are most similar are Melt and Security, because he decided to do away with a lot of the like cymbals on the drumming so that it's mainly just like, you know, the kit itself. And it has that very raw feel to it. You know, it's got this very instinctual way about it. Like that's the only way I can really talk about this. And it has some of my favorite tracks on it. Like I know Melt has some of his more radio friendly tracks. I say that knowing the, you know, material that's found on it, like Biko and Games Without Frontiers, but it also has some like really deep cuts, you know, like I love Family Snapshot, I love No Self-Control, and I also love Not One of Us, and honestly, like Security is one of my all-time favorite records of his, just with Rhythm of the Heat and San Jacinto and Lay Your Hands on Me. These tracks are just so you know, like they're so powerful. They have this tribal aspect to it that like makes you feel a part of the music that it's very hard to capture in other lights. So yeah, I might be cheating a little bit because I unlike a lot of the other albums that were very intentionally like part 1 and part 2, these 2 I think are just more of myself putting that on here. So yeah, I might be cheating a little bit, but it's my list and I can do what I want. All right, number 5. Number 5. This one was very much linked, even though the albums are very different. They were released on the same day, and that goes to Devin Townsend with his 1-2 punch of Deconstruction and Ghost. These 2 records embody the 2 ideals of Devin Townsend. The balls to the wall insanity of Deconstruction that I think for me, it's my favorite metal record of his. You know, it has his best guttural buildups, the proficiency within the guitars, his highs and lows in his vocals. Like, this album has it all. And then on the flip side, Ghost, which I feel doesn't get the praise that it deserves, is my favorite more ambient sound of his. It's his most intimate record. It's slow, it's ambient, it's ethereal, and it has a lot of moments that I love the most, like the title track, but also Dark Matter and Texada, Feather, and it's just so good, you know, and I really wish more people would listen to Ghost because it's one of my all-time favorite records from Devin Townsend. So yeah, moving on to the tops. We get Similitude of a Dream and The Great Adventure from Neil Morse Band. I will go on record to say that the Similitude of a Dream is one of the best records that Neil Morse was ever a part of. I just absolutely love it. The entire journey from start to finish is a magnum opus in terms of progressive rock music. And even though The Great Adventure was a little bit of a downgrade, I still love the big epics. You know, there's only, 5 tracks that range from, some of the big epics that are found on there. It doesn't have that same kind of punch that Similitude of a Dream does, but it still has that Neil Morse essence, that Neil Morse oomph that continues the storyline from The Pilgrim's Journey. So yeah, if you haven't listened to these albums, go ahead and do so because they're so good. And yeah, The Similitude of a Dream is still one of my favorites from Neil Morse. Coming to the top 3, I'm sure a lot of people are like, but what about these albums? Why haven't you talked about these albums? Well, I'm talking about them now. Coming into Hypnotize and Mesmerize from System of a Down. I'm a weird creature when it comes to System of a Down, and I find that Mesmerize and Hypnotize are my 2 favorite records from them. Even though I love Toxicity and I love Steal This Album, there's just something so charged about these 2 records. They're not as balls to the wall insane, even though they have those moments on there. These 2 records hold some of my favorite music from the band. They're dynamic, they're experimenting, they're atmospheric, which is something you don't necessarily attribute to System of a Down. I think this was a great way to end their career. I don't know if they'll ever go into the studio and record more new material, even though they did do a few singles. I don't know if they'll ever do like a full-length album. I think this is a great way for them to cap off that perfect, succinct, 90s and early 2000s career of theirs. Yeah, again, I can recognize and recommend this to almost anybody. Go and listen to Mesmerize. Mesmerize is my favorite of the 2, but Hypnotize still has some really, really outstanding moments on it. Okay, coming down to the last 2, let's start with Opeth and their 1-2 punch of Deliverance and Damnation. Kind of like talking about Devin Townsend, where we had one balls to the wall and one more ethereal. I think this one stands a little bit taller. Deliverance being the intense Opeth. I don't think we have an Opeth record that is this heavy and this consistent within their bigger epics of tracks, Every time I try to pick a favorite track from this record, another one kind of pops up and been like, no, maybe I like that one a little bit more. Or other ones will be like, I think I like that one a little bit more. I do unfortunately think this album gets a little bit overlooked because it is sandwiched between 2 of their masterpieces, being Damnation and Blackwater Park, but man, Deliverance still holds a very special place in my heart. And Damnation being their first non-growl, very softer record, still has that darkness about it. This was how I got my dad into Opeth and how I get a lot of my friends into Opeth that don't really do the screams. I'm like, listen to Damnation. You've got so passionate music on here that's dark, that's menacing, that has the spirit of death metal, but not in the balls to the wall, screaming your balls off essence on it. I do see a lot of people pointing to this album as one of the many masterpieces in the Opeth discography, but really, only Opeth, this band that is known for being this deep, dark, brooding, death metal, progressive band, could pull off this smaller, very light record to this level of virtuosity. So yeah, Deliverance and Damnation, very easy number 2. But my number one might get me a little bit of flack, and that is from Haken with their 1-2 punch of Vector Virus. I will still go on record that Vector is one of my favorite records from Opeth. Very, very easily one of my favorites. There's just something about Vector that I absolutely love. Banger after banger after banger of tracks. Right off the top, with Clear being that through line between these 2 records that gets reprised at the end of Virus. But The Good Doctor, Puzzle Box, Veil, and Nil by Mouth, these 4 tracks are some of the best tracks that Haken has ever written. Virus is one of the weaker albums from Haken, and I will, go on record by saying that. And it is, this list is being carried by Vector, but Virus still has some really good tracks on it. Carousel being one, Prosthetic, that opening track, it just hits with a punch. But honestly, it's that Messiah complex, that big epic right at the end that I like. That epic is one of the best epics in a big catalog of epics, you know. I love that tie-in to the whole Cockroach King, kind of solidifying its standing here. That big finale that's got that like every time I listen to that, I have to crank it as loud as I can get my stereo to crank it to. And then, you know, the final track of Only Stars, a great way to finish it all off, bringing us right back to clear. Again, fantastic work from one of my favorite bands of all time. And that's the list. Those are my double shots, my 1-2 albums. What is your list? I'm opening up the floodgates, whatever you want. It could be volumes 1 and 2. You can go into ones that weren't necessarily planned for, like Batted of Hell or Ziltoid or Joe's Garage. Like any of those. Let me know about all those by commenting down below. And that's where I'm going to leave you today. So, thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out. I'm only realizing now I should have changed my shirt so that it's yellow, so I could have had the vector for this and then the virus for... Anyway, I'm not recording it. I'm leaving it there. So long, everybody.